So, welcome to this next lesson in the Tarot Masterclass, and hope you've been looking carefully at the last two cards we considered. That was the Fool and the Magician. Today we are going to start looking at the High Priestess. Now, as I showed you last time, we're not going to spend 78 months going through all of the cards. The way this course is structured is we're going to focus on the major arcana, which is the 22, and sometimes we'll be doing two or three cards at a time. And then we're going to see how the minor cards work with the major cards, and that's all to come. But today we're going to talk about the High Priestess. And if we're using as a reference point our two decks, the Thoth Tarot, designed by Lady Frida Harris, and uh, the Rider-Waite Tarot, designed by Pamela Coleman Smith, you can see the High Priestess in all her glory there. Now, if we consider the magician as a spiritual rather than traditional physical archetype of the masculine, then the High Priestess embodies the feminine. It's important to remember that these cards represent spiritual rather than material beings. And the same really is true for the Fool, which represents yourself on a journey. Um, in some ways, the magician and the High Priestess can be considered as perfected human spirits. Now, in the tarot, the High Priestess is amongst one of the most enigmatic and mysterious cards of the major arcana. She's frequently depicted as a woman sitting between two pillars holding a scroll with the letters Torah. Now, in the left-hand image here, which is the Rider-Waite or Pamela Coleman Smith deck, you can see the scroll there with Torah. Torah is it's the Jewish book of the law, and it's quite interesting. Um, the scroll itself um, actually suggests hidden knowledge, and that's what the priestess is sitting in front of, hidden knowledge. She often is seen to represent intuition and wisdom and the subconscious mind, and she really symbolizes the divine feminine, embodying the qualities of intuition, mystery, and inner knowing. She's also got access to the unknown. The High Priestess reminds us of the deeper, more mystical aspect to life that we can tap into if we're open and willing to listen. And you can read more on the supporting notes that go with this. But if you look at the Pamela Coleman Smith cards, there's a few things to point out, and we'll try and look at those now. So you've got to start, as with all of these, by looking at the cards themselves, the image of the cards. It's it's a good idea to put aside any guidebooks that come with the cards that you buy. They're useful for later, but for now, we're trying to use the cards to trigger your own connections and your own intuition, because that's how the tarot works. The tarot is a shifting set of keys. So if you only learn the meanings that are often given in the tarot books, you are missing the point of developing your own sort of intuitions. So, as I've suggested, you squint at the cards and in your journal, note the dominant colors or patterns, and then look at the largest, most prominent objects or object. Look at the background and notice any other things that you can see in the card and notice the action. So that's what you could be doing right now. And if you're into this from previous lessons, it might be an idea to stop the video now and get your journal out and look carefully at the cards you're studying. Now, if we look at the card, I'll just point out a few things that you may have already noticed. I've mentioned the Torah, which is the book of wisdom, but at her feet, there is a crescent moon. And if you look at the way that the robe falls off her knees, that gives me the impression of running water, both symbols of the feminine. And she's seated between two pillars, a black one and a white one, with a B and a J on it. And we'll come to that in a moment. Um, between the pillars, behind her, we see flowers or something, and behind that we see another veil. So if you look very carefully at the top part of the connection, you can see a veil of black leaves. So there's a veil of black leaves in front of which are some plants. We'll talk about in a moment. In front of which is sitting the high priestess, and she is guarding the entrance to the space between the pillars. Now, the pillars are Barkim and Boaz and Jachin. My pronunciation is not very good there, but Boaz and Jachin, they are the two pillars which are described in the Bible as the entrance to Solomon's temple. What do you know about Solomon's temple? Well, Solomon's temple, King Solomon, was wise, a wise man, a wise king. And those pillars are also represented or seen in Freemasonry. A few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to go to visit a Freemason temple. I'm not a Freemason, but I went in there, and what we saw were in the middle of their temple room a checkered floor plan, which maybe you've already worked out what that could be. And at the top of the checkered floor plan were two pillars, brass pillars. On top of those pillars, we can see the carved lotus design. Yeah. Now, in Jewish tradition, Yachin actually means he will establish. In this case, it would have been the he being God. And remember, we're talking about a different kind of God here in many senses to the traditional Christian God. And Boaz means in strength. He will provide in strength. So the pillars are there to remind us that the temple is established by God or the oneness themselves. So the high priestess is sitting right in front of this temple. We see the lotus buds and the at the top of the pillars, and these buds are opened, and they remind us that the high priestess, sorry, they're not opened. That's right. High priest, a priestess represents potential and virginity in that sense. Um, Now, what are the other things? Well, she is, you notice that there's a cross on her chest. That is not a Christian cross. We'll talk about that in a moment. Behind her, those flowers are supposed to be pomegranates. And pomegranates are the seeds of potential growth. You see how deep this symbolism is going. And notice also behind, way behind the pillars, behind the veil, you can actually see the sea and the landscape. And that probably tells you something about it. It's an expanse of water behind her. Yeah. So these elements are there to suggest certain things about the nature of the high priestess. The cross of matter, material things, a crown is the triple moon, the full moon, and the waxing and waning moons. So it goes without saying, really, that this is a very feminine image and it is a lunar image. And the black and the white, you can consider it to be yin and yang, balance. She is sitting right in the middle of those two pillars. Now, if you think back to the lesson on the Kabbalah, and when we introduce the Kabbalah, you will know the Kabbalah is made of three pillars, a left-hand pillar, a right-hand pillar, and a middle pillar. And the middle pillar is the one of balance. And that's where she is sitting, in the place of the middle pillar. So, when you look at the imagery of this card, consider the main colors, yellow, green in the background, and the blue, white robes, and the black and white columns, and the yellow crescent moon, and also the yellow of the floor underneath the robe. Consider those colors as being relevant and important to the image. And what do they suggest to you? This is what we're trying to work on. We're trying to move away from what the textbook says and letting this inspire you. Um, what's the story? Well, I've hinted at the story. Guardian of the pathway between two pillars. She holds the book of the law. She's very regal, and there are moon and lunar and water connections. So this is the imagery and what the story is trying to tell you. Notice that she's sitting very regally. She's passive, she's waiting, and that's kind of an important idea for you to grasp. And what else is there? Well, we mentioned pomegranates and palm leaves. That was the other thing in the background. And the palm leaves there. There's two veils, which is a bit difficult to see until you really appreciate. There's the veil behind the flowers, which is sort of black leaves. And then there's the veil that she is wearing herself. Um, and the two veils, the mystery of the veils, I'll leave you to ponder that. Um, and we've got the lunar headdress and crescent moon. So the way you work with this really is you start with your initial reactions and then you move on to exploring the symbolic references I've hinted at. You can look those up and try not to look them up in books on the tarot. Try to look them up in other books on occult symbolism because these images, and particularly this image, was drew heavily upon Freemasonry because the Golden Dawn was an attempt to turn Freemasonry into something more spiritual and mystical. So do your research. And who is the High Priestess? You know, who would be the High Priestess? Again, one of the things we can start to do more and more now is start to think of people that you know, people in your own life that you would consider that embodies some of the qualities of this particular character. Okay, so if you've got the Rider-Waite deck, that's the way to go. In fact, it's the way to go with any deck. With over 2,000 different tarot decks available, it depends on what you're using. If, for example, you have a deck based upon the fairy laws or on Lord of the Rings or on the Arthurian myth, you will have a different set of images for the High Priestess, but those images say the same kind of things and relate to the character in the stories or the myth. So let's look um, at Lady Frida Harris's drawing of the priestess in the Thoth deck. Uh, this is rather beautiful, this image, because we actually see the high priestess herself standing in front of what looks like the entrance to a cave or the entrance to a hidden chamber. And she has her arms outstretched and she's standing there. It's deliberately meant to remind you of Isis. That's the idea. Notice that on her lap, she has a bow with an arrow and then lines of energy. If you remember on The Magician, there were these lines of energy, this network of connecting threads that came from The Magician. Well, that kind of theme is followed up in The Priestess. At the bottom of the card, you see crystals and leaves and pine cones and a camel and grapes and sunflowers. And again, these are really important symbols, bearing in mind that the Crowley deck or the Thoth Tarot or the Lady Frida Harris Tarot draws heavily upon Egyptian symbolism and Egyptian myth. So, same kind of thing, imagery. What are the main colors? Well, the blues, shades of blues and kind of yellowy blues. There's a gray-white figure with her arms outstretched upwards, and there's white-blue web or energy lines, as well as the colors of the crystals and the sunflower and the pine cones beneath. And again, these are worth thinking about. What's the story? Well, is the high priestess weaving a web of these energy fibers? Is she? What is she doing with her arms outstretched? She has her eyes closed, and if you look very, very closely, her eyes, it looks like she's wearing glasses. In fact, it isn't. That's an infinity symbol around her eyes. That's kind of relevant. She's wearing the crescent moon headdress, which we saw in the other tarot deck. She has a bow. What's all that about? She's obviously guarding some inner space, and it's a secret space because it's dark. We can't see into that space. And there are fruits, flowers, and crystals, and there's a camel. We'll talk about that later. Now, one of the things I think is particularly beautiful about the Thoth Tarot is many of the cards connect. If you lay them end to end, you will see some interesting connections. So this works with the major cards as well as the minor cards. In fact, sometimes it's easier to see in the minor cards. But if we place the magician above the high priestess, notice that the energy coming from the feet of the magician can be imagined to be captured by the cauldron shape of the high priestess's arms. And I think that's a rather beautiful thing. So, what is she doing? What is she actually doing with that energy? Is she organizing it? Notice that the energy is actually in squares and net patterns, whereas in the magician, it's just straight lines. Yeah. Um, so have a think about that. So we move down. What else is there? We've already mentioned there's the bow, there's the crystals, the pine cones, the sunflower, the grapes, and the camel. Well, go through some of these in a way. The camel is holds water. That's what a camel does, and water suggests different kinds of consciousness. Water is often associated with the unconscious. Um, the water also represents baptism. Yeah. So maybe the camel is a representation of carrying of water or inner consciousness. You can play with that if you want to and think about it, or you can go back and look at why the camel is important to Egyptian peoples. The crown of Isis, she's wearing that crown. It's very common, and it represents the stage of the moon and cycles of life. And there are seven moon crescents underneath of it, underneath that moon. I mean, underneath that crown. Well, seven crescents. Well, seven is the number associated with Venus, and you'll see there's a link between this card and the next card in a moment. We mentioned the affinity symbols, infinity symbols. She's sitting on the throne. Now, this is rather interesting. I mentioned the sort of structure behind her. Well, if you look at it carefully, not only is it dark space underneath the structures, if you can go in there, but it is actually a seat that she can sit on. So she's sitting on that throne. What does the bow and arrow represent? Think about a bow and arrow. What happens when you pull a bow and an arrow? It actually is about the focusing of intention. When we let an arrow go, it's that intention being let go into the world. Again, look at the notes that come with this. What else have we got? We've got the pine cones and the grapes. Well, again, there is a link here to a a sphere on the Kabbalah, on the Tree of Life, called Tifereth, which is the sphere of beauty. And there are links here that you might like to explore if you're going to explore um, the Kabbalah in any detail. The flower on the right side has 10 petals, and 10 on the Kabbalah is the number of manifestation. It is the number of Malkuth. The flower on the left side has concave petals, possibly representing reception. Um, the camel, well, that's actually like the high priestess sitting between uh, the two pillars. Now, I must mention that the pillars here aren't that clear, but on the left and on the right of this card, those lines actually form pillars. So the two pillars we saw in the previous card are still there. They're just not overly obvious, and and they're not labeled either. Um, Grapes associated with with Dionysus, and the pine cone is associated with Bacchus, which again is plenty. Again, there's lots here for you to look at and think about. At this stage, I will ask you to not consider these cards for doing readings. Consider these cards as triggers for your imagination to find deeper meanings. Use these cards as a meditation. Now, some of the things I've been talking about are on this diagram here, which kind of makes a lot more sense when you see it and you actually see the way that these things are actually represented. Again, go away and look at this and study this. Use your journal to capture your thoughts. And then, of course, we need to find meaning in all of this. And as I've said before, the process is the same. You start with your initial reactions. In some cases, I start by saying I either like the card or I don't like the card. It resonates to me or it makes me feel a certain way. Then move on to distinguishing the symbols, which we started to talk about, but I've left it so open that you can explore it yourself. And then try and understand the mystical references. Do some research on Isis, do some research on Dionysus, do some reflections on the camel and what it could mean, and crystals, what they mean. Understand those mystical references, and then ask yourself, who is the high priestess? Is there somebody you can think about that encapsulates all the things that are referenced in this card? And remember, this card is really about an archetype of a spiritual being rather than an archetype of a real material person. And that's about it. That's, if you read the notes that go with this, and if you listen to this again, you're going to start to piece things together. But next month, we're going to focus on the Empress and the Emperor, two cards that next in sequence, cards 3 and 4. And the big difference between the Empress and the Emperor is we can consider these as material. So the Fool is the person doing the journey. The Magician and the High Priestess are spiritual, but the Empress and the Emperor can be thought of as being material. So more about that next month. If you've got any questions, then drop me a line. If not, keep working on your journals. And as I said at the start of this course, the best way to connect with the cards you're using is to use them as a focus for your meditations and your research, and then more meditations.